Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful for this day, the opportunity to study your word together. And we ask for your Holy Spirit to guide in this study as we try to pull together some of the lines in the book of Daniel and to make sense out of them and to see where this light can continue to shine upon our path. We pray for each person, each family, the contacts that we have. I pray for my students, people that I see on a regular basis who don't know this message, and also for the church members that may be open to understand these things. We just ask, Lord, for your Holy Spirit to work upon our own hearts, that we can be converted, and that we can reflect your character. We're thankful for the prophet Daniel and the visions that you gave him, and we ask for an understanding of them. And we pray and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our continued studies on the book of Leviticus and the book of Daniel, or Leviticus 26 and the book of Daniel. And I figured that we at least have 2 studies left, this study and next week, but there might be a third, depending on how things go. Now, one of the things is obviously we're going to study Daniel chapter 11, and there's a lot there that, I don't fully understand. I know that Elder Jeff has been presenting lots on Daniel chapter 11, and I'm going to try to share some of the things that I understand, but maybe as we go through it, we'll start to get some insights on Daniel 11. I don't think we'll get to Daniel 11 today beyond the first 4 verses. That's kind of where my goal is. And as you can see, I have this matrix set up to examine the relationship between Leviticus 26 and Daniel. And I did this originally back in 2013, but I never fully developed it. Nobody really helped me with it. And often, if you're studying something, you really need input from other people if you're going to put that together and to understand it. So, maybe we can together go through this and people can have some suggestions on how to understand the connection between these books. Now, so as we go into this, this part of it, we need to look at Leviticus 26 itself, and we're going to put each of these on a line. So we're going to go through the first 4 7 times, and I'm not going to bring my Bible up on the screen because I'm going to be writing things down, so it'll be handy if you have your Bible there. Now, in Leviticus 26, we know that it starts out with these blessings, but what we're focusing upon is the curses, what we call the 4 7 times. And we know that there's this natural consequence of disobeying God's sabbatical rest of the land that God's people would experience. And just commenting on that, so when a lot of people read Leviticus 26, one is they don't recognize what the blessings are about, because it will talk about the Sabbath. If you keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. Now, of course, that would refer to the 7th-day Sabbath. But in the context of Leviticus 25, where Leviticus 26 follows, you can see that it also is including the Sabbath rest of the land. So when it talks about Sabbaths there, it's not just talking about the 7th-day Sabbath. And it's not talking about the feast days in that context. And there are other places in the Old Testament too where people often see Sabbaths and they will think that this is a reference to feast days. Now, the feast days are types of Sabbaths, but it depends on the context of what's being referred to. And I know in Exodus 31:13 and Ezekiel 20:12 and 20:20, we often see that as a reference to the 7th-day Sabbath, and it is. But it's also a reference to, hallow my Sabbaths, for they shall be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord that sanctifies you or makes you holy. And those references there are referring not just to the weekly Sabbath, but also to the Sabbath rest of the land, because they're tied together. And often as Seventh-day Adventists, we've ignored the Sabbath rest of the land because, well, we're keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, but many of us are not keeping the Sabbath rest of the land. It's not a requirement, though it is a blessing to do so. But we never followed that as Seventh-day Adventists, just like we don't follow feast days. So the Sabbath rest of the land has a typical importance, and that typical importance, of course, is tied to these prophecies as well, and especially the 6,000 years of sin, and then the millennium. So there's this part of understanding Leviticus 26 that really needs to be put in place if people are going to understand the blessings and then the curses. Now, the blessings, of course, result from keeping the rest of the land, and there's some of the things wouldn't seem like a natural result, like protection from your enemies. But if you're faithful to God, God's going to protect you. And if you're not faithful, that protection is not because God doesn't want to protect you, but he can't protect you. And it's not that God doesn't have the power to protect you. It's just that Satan now has an opportunity to come in. And that's not a well understood concept, because some people think that God is somehow unable to, in the sense that he's powerless, that Satan sort of has power. But it has to do with the principles that God is showing, that God is not going to protect us from these consequences of neglect of his principles, because that would be putting a blessing upon that action. So God is going to withdraw his protection. But when it comes to the 4-7 times themselves, these are restorative chastisements or punishments. So we're in a situation, or Israel is in a situation, where they're not following what God wants them to do. He allows some natural consequences to occur. But now he has to do these corrective chastisements. And that's what these 4-7 times are. Now, if we think about it, the book of Daniel is dealing with the end of the captivity. So we know that Daniel is taken captive in the second 7 times, which we've studied, but we're going to put it on here as well. And that his concern is always about the end of the captivity. They're in captivity, and these are prophecies that are related to coming out of captivity. That's the purpose of these prophecies. It's not just to tell us about the future, it's to tell us the situation that the Israelites were in and how God is going to restore them. And this becomes typical for the events at the end of the world. So that's why it's so important to us now. We're not just studying it because it's some curiosity about ancient Israel. The events of ancient Israel become typical of modern Israel. Now, so we think about these 4-7 times, they're actually chastisements that lead God's people into captivity, but these are corrective. So God is not just punishing them and then, hoping that, if he punishes them, that they're just somehow going to repent and then he can restore them. There is an idea there, of course, that punishments come because God wants you to turn to him, right? He wants these consequences of your sin to be revealed. But this restoration shouldn't just be seen in the reform lines themselves, which is my point, is that each of these chastisements in and of itself is a restoration. Now, I think about my personal life. When my life started to go bad some years ago, I prayed to God and I asked him to destroy my life and to rebuild it. And because I recognized that I couldn't get back on track from where I was at. I was just kind of spinning my wheels. And sometimes you have to get to this point where you lose everything before you can rebuild. It's like you have a structure, a building that's dilapidated. And I did some work on a building like that in 2018, where, you know, the floors are rotten and so forth. And you can patch it up and fix it up, but it's not like building a new house. What you really needed, and what we really needed to do in that situation, if we had the time and the money, is to actually tear the house down and start anew. Because if you keep putting new wine into old bottles, or a new piece of garment on a garment that's worn, it's not really going to help that garment. And so God was not just seeking to do a patch job. It wasn't going to be a duct tape job, like my dad would do. He wants to restore God's people. And so this is about complete restoration from sin. Now, we know that this story of ancient Israel, it connects to right from the beginning of sin. There's this connection, and we've seen this in the structure of prophetic chronology that we've been doing on Sundays, that there's this connection between right when sin originates in God's gospel promise to the end in Revelation, the seed of the woman and the serpent. And so we can see that there's all these connections, even in the book of Daniel, to past histories. And then, you know, these all become typical. And when I say that, you know, I use that word typical all the time because as Seventh-day Adventists, we should understand what it means. But it's more than just symbolic. Types contain within them, I can't even really think of the word. A seed maybe is a good illustration. They carry a seed of something, like the seed of the woman. You know, it contains in it so many different things. So so when we look at this idea of what's happening in the book of Daniel, we can see that there's these literal events, and then trying to understand them at the end of time in a spiritual sense. It's not as simple as we would think, because people have many different interpretations. So I'm not really expressing it well, but I do think as we look at this matrix that we're going to line up, that we'll get some idea of this. Now, of course, when we go to Leviticus 26, the 4 7 times themselves, we'll read each of them and put them on here. So we're going to be putting them in this first column. And it says, "And if ye will not yet for all this hearken unto me, then I will punish you 7 times more for your sins." And we've looked at that word 7 times more, or that phrase 7 times more. Literally in Hebrew, I will prolong to punish you 7 for your sins. So the more there is not a comparative, a degree. It actually is an addition. So God's going to additionally punish us 7 times, or 7. And then it's the event is, I will break the pride of your power, and I will make your heaven as iron and your earth as brass, and your strength shall be spent in vain, for your land shall not yield her increase, neither shall the trees of the land yield their fruits. Now, I've focused a lot of attention in these studies upon the breaking of the pride of power, and in other studies when I'm dealing with the 7 times. But there is more to it. Your heaven's going to be as iron and your earth as brass. And we saw that when we studied Daniel chapter 4, those symbols of iron and brass show up. But also the symbolism of trees and fruits and land and the increase. So when we look at this event, the breaking of the pride of the power, we mark it for Judah in 677 with the taking of Manasseh captive to Babylon, and we mark it in 723 with Hoshea's captivity 2 years before the fall of Samaria. But yet there's this other part: your heaven shall be as iron and your earth as brass. And I could spend some time looking at this, but the idea of the heaven being iron has to do with our connection with God is severed, and the earth is being brass, is this idea that it's not productive. So, I probably should look at those verses. I'm not. But the idea is that we have lost our connection with God. So when this captivity of Manasseh happens, he recognizes that separation from God, and then he turns to God. So from his perspective, there's a turning to God that happens because he's in affliction and he's carried to Babylon. He's in affliction there, and he turns to God. So the heaven being iron and the earth is brass is a symbol of that. Now the land itself not yielding or increase, that means there's this other consequence that happened when Manasseh was taken captive, which is also part of what happens in the there's the blessings, and then the initial curses are connected really with the land. And so the first 7 times also has additional judgments or chastisements regarding the land. And I don't really know what those are, but it seems that there may be drought associated with it, or it could even just be the fact that the people are going to go into captivity starting in 677 to some degree. Mostly that's northern Israel though. So I'm not really sure what that would all mean. But if we're going to put these on this line, we need to recognize each of these. So you've got the pride of power. And then you have the earth is iron and brass. So heaven's iron, pardon me. Heaven's iron. And the earth is brass. And then we have this other thing that the land and the trees are affected. So they will not yield their increase. So the land and the trees are affected. They're not going to yield their increase or their fruits. I can never remember how to spell the word yield. No. Oh.
E-I-L-D.
It's E-I-L-D? You sure? It looks wrong no matter which way I spell it. So, okay.
Sorry, I before E.
I before E? Okay. Well, that's how I spelled it first, but it never looks right.
Yeah, that's right.
That doesn't look right. Neither one does.
Anyway.
Okay, so we have that as the first 7 times. Now, in my the idea of placing this as a matrix, we're first going to go down Leviticus 26, and then we're going to go through each of these and how they line up. Now, the second 7 times is the one where I'll send wild beasts among you, which shall rob you of your children, destroy your cattle, and make you few in number. But there's another aspect that we often neglect again, and that is your highways shall be desolate. So wild beasts, which will rob you of your children, and then you're going to have your highways are desolate. We'll see the significance of these things, why they're mentioned. So your highways are desolate. I know you probably can't read that, but highways, let me do this better, are desolate. And then the third one, which actually has a lot to it. And so I'm going to try to sum it up because I can't write it all in there. But basically you have a siege and then the breaking of the staff of bread. So it says, I will bring a sword upon you that shall avenge the quarrel of my covenant, which we need to understand what that is. And when ye are gathered together within your cities, I will send the pestilence among you, and ye shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy. And when I have broken the staff of your bread, 10 women shall bake your bread in one oven, and they shall deliver you your bread again by weight. Ye shall eat and not be satisfied. So this we have marked so this is the captivity of Daniel. This is Manasseh, captivity of Daniel. And this is going to be the captivity of Jehoiachin. So I probably, could have written that in. But here we're going to have the siege, which has a pestilence with it. And then we're going to have the quarrel of the covenant. And then we're going to have the breaking of the staff of bread. Which, of course, would be a famine. And we know with Jehoiachin, it says, they shall measure your bread by weight. And so with Jehoiachin, that was literally fulfilled, though there's a symbolic aspect to this as well. And then the fourth 7 times, when we look at this one, we're going to see that it combines all of these elements. And that one starts in verse 28. So first it talks about the siege, ye shall eat the flesh of your sons and the flesh of your daughters. And I'll destroy your high places, cut down your images, cast your carcasses upon the carcasses of your idols. I will make your cities waste, bring your sanctuaries unto desolation, and will not smell the savor of your sweet odors. And I'll bring the land into desolation, and your enemies which dwell therein shall be astonished at it. And I will scatter you among the heathen, and will draw out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. And that's when it says, then shall the land enjoy her Sabbaths, as long as it lieth desolate, and ye be in your enemy's land. Even shall the land rest and enjoy her Sabbaths. As long as it lieth desolate, it shall rest, because it did not rest in your Sabbaths when ye dwelt upon it. And there's a lot more to it. And there's also, in the fourth 7 times, there is the promise about God's people, if they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers with their trespass, which they trespassed against me, that also they have walked contrary unto me, that I also have walked contrary unto them, and have brought them into the land of their enemies. If their uncircumcised hearts be humbled, and they then accept of the punishment of their iniquity, then will I remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham will I remember, and I will remember the land. And the land also shall be left of them, and shall enjoy her Sabbaths, while she lay desolate without them. And they shall accept of the punishment of their iniquity, because they despise my judgments, and because their soul abhorred my statutes. Now, and this becomes a really important part of this fourth one, to see first that everything that has happened in the first 3 is now magnified in the fourth and occurs. So when Zedekiah is killed, that's obviously the breaking of the pride of power, because now they have no kingship. We can also see that from that point on, there's going to be another 49 years since, starting from when Daniel was taken captive, which had been 21 years to Zedekiah. Now there's going to be an additional 49 years, which will complete this period of 70 years. So when it talks about the land shall enjoy her Sabbaths, it's not starting from 586. It's starting from the second 7 times. And we can see how the heaven is iron and the earth is brass, and the land not yielding her increase, or the trees their fruit, how that applies. So there's this 49 years that's left, but also we can see in the third 7 times, this one talked about the city and the sanctuary, or the sanctuaries, but we can see that this also then is going to apply in the fourth 7 times. So, well, I shouldn't say the third one doesn't really deal with the sanctuary, it deals more with the city, the siege. But the fourth 7 times is going to address your sanctuaries and your high places. Now, if you think about when this was written in the time of Moses. Obviously, Moses wrote Leviticus 26. And there was not at that time the northern and the southern kingdom. And they're just given this instruction for making the sanctuary in Leviticus 26, or in Leviticus. And so now in Leviticus 26, it's going to talk about your sanctuaries. So God has foreseen that if they had departed from keeping the Sabbath rest of the land, that they're also going to have other false worship come in. And it talks about your idols and so forth. So God has foreseen that if you continue to worship correctly, you're not going to end up disregarding the Sabbath rest of the land. So the Sabbath rest of the land is a result, or the failure to keep the rest of the land is a result of false worship. And of course, we saw that with especially with Solomon, the compromises that he made. But even then, if you look at Saul, he's not necessarily doing openly false worship, though he does visit the witch of Endor at some point. But we do see that God's people is still not completely committed to him at the time when Saul becomes king. Sure, they're united under a king, they're looking for a king, but they still have many of the ideas of paganism. And one is they think that they need a king, is a very pagan concept to protect them, where they should have just had God to protect them. So there's a lot of things there that we're not going to look at in detail, but are important. If you're going to study into this very deeply. So when we deal with the fourth 7 times, then we just say all of the above. All right, so everything here. Now I put up in the top left-hand corner of this chart 3 plus 1. And so this is a 3-1 combination. You can see the 3, and then this 1 here is the fourth, but it's going to take all these and place it down here. Now, the way I wrote this out is the way I wrote it out in our notes. Sometimes I think I should have done it in a bit different order, but we're going to look at Daniel's prophecies. Now, we should know them all, and we know that we have the prophecy of Daniel 2, and wild beasts is Daniel 7. And we can look at Daniel 2 and we can see that this is about the image, where it begins with Babylon as the head of gold. And this is about pride of power. And we can see this in the narrative dealing with Nebuchadnezzar, which we would place as Daniel 3 and 4, if you're going to deal with Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel 2 deals with this statue, and you can see, of course, Daniel 3 is going to address that. And then Daniel 4 is going to address the personal pride of Nebuchadnezzar and have his conversion. So one is, you can see here in this Daniel 2, the kingdoms. We're going to have, the kingdoms, if you want to look at it this way, or specifically the kingship, because thou, Nebuchadnezzar, art thou head of gold. So it's about this kingship, and it's about pride, right? So you can see it's about pride of kingship, or pride of power, right? So you can see that it directly relates to this first 7 times. Now, of course, Daniel 7, we can see that this relates in that wild beasts shall rob you of your children. Well, Daniel 7 is about these wild beasts. Now, the wild beasts here, in this one, it talks about your highways will be desolate. And this image of the wild beasts, in trying to understand what highways are, we're going to really look as we go through some of these other narratives. But this is going to be important as we look at the kingdoms and the narratives a little bit. So we got these wild beasts. Now, if we're going to try to put a narrative that's going to connect with this, we don't have any specific narratives that address wild beasts, right? So this is where, to try to figure this out, we're going to think about this a little bit. Then the third 7 times, this is about the quarrel of the covenant, the breaking of the staff of bread. And I don't think it's evident that we can see what it addresses. Until, if we look at the different visions, Daniel 8, Daniel 9, 10, 11, and 12, can we match this up with any of those? Now, this quarrel of the covenant is addressing an issue, and that's where I think that we could then look at what visions this addresses. So the covenant is about God's promises, which are expressed in the sanctuary service. I would look at the quarrel of the covenant differently than a lot of other people have, is that I would look at this about the issues of the covenant, the symbolic nature of the sanctuary service. Now, in this one, of course, the city itself is addressed, this siege, and the only way that I can sort of connect this, if I wanted to connect it, is I would take in Daniel 8, the latter part of Daniel 8 deals with the siege by Rome. So Daniel 8. So you have the siege by Rome that's addressed at the end of it, which we saw was in Deuteronomy 28. So, but we know Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26 are sister chapters. They're related. They're basically the same thing, but one is dealing with Babylon, the other one's dealing with Rome. So this quarrel of the covenant, where I would look at it, is this issue over the sanctuary. And I'm not sure necessarily this idea of a quarrel or an argument. This would introduce, to me, intellectual philosophy. So I don't know, people might, intellectual philosophy. So I see this in this idea of a quarrel of the covenant. And how is intellectual philosophy addressed in Daniel 8 would be the issue that I think that would be trying to understand. Now, I would also put here Daniel 9, because to me, Daniel 8 and Daniel 9 are connected. So I don't have a lot of room to write everything in here, but I at least want to get Daniel 8 up here to see that this parallels the third 7 times. And you're going to see it more as we go into these other ones. Now, where I would then say that everything is addressed is basically Daniel 10 to 12 reviews all of this in a different way. So everything that we see in the first visions, we could say the first, these 2 dreams and then these 2 visions are also seen in this. So we're going to see everything going right back from the beginning. Though, obviously Babylon isn't really directly addressed because you're starting in the Medo-Persian period. But you're going to see that it is addressed in the sense for the fall of Babylon. So you're going to deal with the fall of Babylon, the transition to Medo-Persia, and all of the different issues in here are going to be addressed. And there's a lot in here, like to actually study Daniel 10, 11, and 12 in the context of the rest of these chapters is a big study. It's something that, I've touched on in my personal study. I've never really completed it. Daniel 10, 11, and 12 has more in it than I can comprehend at this point. Now, we have these narratives. So I put Daniel 3 and 4 in this narrative. Now, Daniel 1, I don't have listed in the narratives on my paper, I don't think. But I would put Daniel 1 here because of course that's going to deal with the wild beasts robbing you of your children. So Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, obviously is Daniel's captivity. Now, the other narrative that I would place in here is Daniel 6. Now, the reason I placed Daniel 6 is this is about the law of the Medes and the Persians. And this aspect here about laws, we also see in Daniel 7, we see times and laws. This fourth beast is going to seek to change times and laws. Highways are part of a civil structure. When you have highways, the implication is you have government. You have laws guiding things. They're not just stray paths that people are using. These are highways, and highways are things that are controlled by the government to allow the transportation of goods safely. So we can see that Daniel 6 obviously deals with the laws of the Medes and the Persians. That's where, of course, Daniel prays. They lay a trap to him that anybody who prays to any god except the king would be thrown into a den of lions, and so we're all familiar with that story. So I would put Daniel 6 in here. Now, in this one dealing with the siege, we can see this is the quarrel of the covenant, the breaking of the staff of bread. There's this intellectual philosophy. Where I would put the story that I would put here is Daniel 5, though I could put it other places. I can't remember where I put it before. I didn't even really look at my old notes on this. But I would see Daniel 5 is dealing with the fall of Babylon. But there's also some sanctuary symbolism in there. And, one is the lampstand. We can see that God's system has been captured by Babylon. And it's been placed in this. So Daniel chapter 5, I've dealt with this other places. I don't know how much I dealt with it here. I don't think I have. But when Babylon fell on October 13th, 539 BC, what the Babylonians were doing, starting earlier in the year, is they began to bring all the gods from all the different cities to Babylon for this Akitu festival. And this feast that's occurring in October is the Akitu festival. It's the fall festival. The Babylonians had a spring festival, like the Jews did. Theirs starts on the first day of their first month and goes to the 10th day of the first month. And then they also have this fall festival, which is connected with the moon. So it varies of when people say that it was actually observed. This date here is on the 16th day of the first month on the Babylonian calendar, and October 13th is the 16th day of the 7th month on the Babylonian calendar in 539 BC. And that actually does line up with what most people say where the Akitu festival should be. So it seems likely that that's what's actually happening. They're having a feast and they're drinking to the gods of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and stone. They're worshiping these gods. And so we can see that this would be, when I think about the quarrel of the covenant, I do think about the daily, right? So that to me is an issue here. So I could even bring, as we brought Daniel 8 into here. This issue of the sanctuary is an issue about the daily. It's about true and false worship. And that's why I put in intellectual philosophy, which you don't see quite from Daniel chapter 8, except in the idea that the daily and paganism and papalism are both about the covenant that God has made, and their counterfeits, or their arguments against or arguments about how to worship God. So that's why I would place that there. Now, placing Daniel chapter 9 here, in connecting it here, one is because it's connected to Daniel chapter 8. But this directly addresses the sanctuary. Both of these do, but Daniel chapter 9 addresses the starting point for the 2300 days. but it also addresses the covenant, because Messiah is going to be cut off in the midst of the week. He's going to confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. So when we look about this quarrel of the covenant, about these offerings and sacrifices, I would see that Daniel 9 fits into that. So, like, if anybody has comments or things that I should add or things that they think I'm doing wrong here, please jump in. So putting Daniel 5 here with the fall of Babylon, to me, this is about the counterfeit worship. And you can see, of course, Daniel 8 is about counterfeit worship. So that's what this line is dealing with. Now, I don't really have a narrative for Daniel chapter 10 to 12, other than I could argue that Daniel 10 is the narrative for the prophecies in Daniel 12. So maybe that's what I should do, because Daniel 11 and 12 are the prophecies. And I would say the narrative to help us understand that would be Daniel chapter 10. And Daniel chapter 10 is addressing, and we're going to look at this. So right now I'm laying this out. We're not studying these yet. But Daniel chapter 10, when we look into it, we will start to see how this is addressing all of these. And that's the only way I can put it for now. So, because we haven't studied this yet, So I should write some things in here. Of course, we have the laws of the Medes and Persians. So these laws, which cannot be changed. And then in Daniel 5, you have false worship, and you also have the issues of the sanctuary in that false worship, because you have the sanctuary mixed, we'll say, with idols. Right. So we have the vessels from the sanctuary being drunk in. We also see the golden lampstand, and so we see that element there. And then when we deal with the four kingdoms themselves, so this is obviously pretty easy. We would look at Babylon, and we would look at the characteristics of these kingdoms, the Medes and Persians, Greece, and then finally Rome. And when we think about Babylon as a kingdom, obviously it's the glory of kingdoms. It's this golden kingdom. It's the kingdom about pride. And so if you're going to look at this pride of power, out of all of these, the ones that would symbolize it the most is Babylon, right? So that, again, you're going to see this pride of power. You see it in Nebuchadnezzar, and you see it in how both Assyria and Babylon use their power to manipulate the kingdoms around them. Now, when it comes to the Medo-Persian kingdom, I mean, we can see here the basic principle is about the laws of the Medes and Persians. So in this one, of course, we have some symbols that tie here, the wild beasts, but it's this part, the highways are desolate, times and laws of the Medes and Persians. So again, we can see that this deals with law, or laws. And that's what the Medes and Persians are known for. And I watched some documentaries on Persepolis, which is the city of Persia. That's what Persepolis means. And it is an amazing, was an amazing city. One of the glorious, the most amazing, beautiful cities that ever existed. You know, the description of it, and their ruins still lie there and show a testimony of what it once was. But they were extremely orderly. They created a system of water purification, water transportation, sanitation, So if you're talking about, civic sort of organization, it's an example of one of the greatest examples of this in the ancient world, so that they could maintain their society in basically a desert for a long period of time by the way that they organize things. So these laws, this civil laws that you see, are definitely demonstrated in Medo-Persia. Now, of course, Greece, we all know what Greece is about. And we also, Heidi and I watched a video about the rise of Greece, of Athens. And it was very, very interesting to see how quickly they rose once they started to organize. Because Greece was all these different tribes, and Athens really became the center of this. And they became the center of, basically, they're the foundation for our philosophy that we have today, of course, dealing with Socrates, starting with Socrates, who began this system of philosophy that the Romans continued to follow as well. So some pretty amazing history when it comes to Greece that applies to this idea. So one is this false worship, but it's a philosophy about worship, where in the past, people had false worship, but now they start to develop this intellectual philosophy about worship. And, God's answer to that is because there's this quarrel of the covenant. And within Christianity, we can see that it's intellectual philosophy that has destroyed the gospel. So people can argue away the realities of the Bible, the realities of sin, and develop a philosophy that basically you can turn however you want. You can manipulate ideas to such a point that you can basically believe whatever you want. You can find a reason for believing whatever you want. So obviously Greece is about philosophy and false worship. Now, when we look at Rome, we can see how Rome parallels this idea of combining the elements of the kingdoms before it. Rome is syncretistic. That is, and we see this in Roman Catholicism as well. So Rome would allow people to keep their customs and traditions, keep their local gods. They just would invite Roman civilization and protection. And we see this also in the Catholic Church, in countries that they've gone into that are very pagan, Central America, South America, India, places like this. People still, you don't see much difference in the worship of false gods and true gods in those areas. So obviously the idols and all those types of things that occur, Roman Catholicism just adopts right from the beginning, adopts and adapts the worship that people have. As long as you believe certain things and acknowledge the authority of the church in some areas of your life, then Rome will leave you alone. You can have all kinds of false ideas as long as they don't contradict Rome's basic philosophy. So the practices can be incorporated into Roman Catholicism, and of course Rome did this as well. So this idea of combining, all the principles of Babylon, pride of power. We see this in Rome as well. You see, Rome is a lot about laws, and of course they continue the philosophy of Greece and have all kinds of false worship, mystery cults, and so forth. So you can see here in this simple matrix that there's a structure that connects Daniel to Leviticus 26. And in my initial premise when we started this, we said that there was this typological connection between the book of Daniel. The types that are used in Leviticus 26 are seen in the book of Daniel. We also see that the structure So the idea of the structure, that's one both chronological. So we see the chronology of the book of Daniel is based upon this 7 times. So that the prophecies of Daniel are based upon the 7 times. So the prophecies themselves are connected to Leviticus 26. We saw that particularly with the 490 years, which is based on 7 times. And that 7 years becomes this structure in the 490 years that we saw. I believe it was last presentation when we did Daniel 9, where we saw this structure of the 490 years that was based upon the Jubilee and sabbatical cycles at the beginning, at the end, and the internal structure, and connecting it with Lamech, the 777, and the 70 times 7. So the fact that, those numbers, 70 times 7 and 777, show up in that structure in Daniel chapter 9 is pretty profound. So we can see we got the typology, the structure, and the language. So we can see a lot of the language, the words that are used in the book of Daniel, especially Daniel 4, is definitely taken from Leviticus 26. So Nebuchadnezzar's 7 times is not just, there's basically a precedent for it, and that is Leviticus 26. And it has way more meaning when you put it into that context of Leviticus 26. And, even when we dealt with Daniel chapter 5, the mene, tekel, upharsin, which is, we talked about breaking the staff of your bread and they shall measure your bread by weight. Well, we see that in Daniel chapter 5, we have this measurement, a manna or a mene. Basically, there was no difference between money and weights because you weighed things to find, you weighed gold or silver, and you would weigh things, and the idea of weights and money is really interconnected. So when it says you shall measure your bread by weight, we can see in Daniel chapter 5, we can see the measurement that goes on here as well. So you got all these types of symbolism, language, and structure in Leviticus 26 that then is expressed in the book of Daniel. So, that's why this is helpful. And I know, nobody else has helped me with this. I would really like it if somebody would take a bit more time. Maybe for your personal study, you might go through this and think about it and add some things and maybe even make some changes in your thinking, in my thinking, to how that works. Now, Angela asked about the word high in Leviticus 26:22. It's a supplied word. Well, it may be a supplied word, but it's put there for a reason, because the word high doesn't exist. But when you look at the word ways, because that's the word there, highways. Okay, she says here, high, Leviticus 26:22 is a supplied word. Highways are separate words. So I think this is speaking of the vanity of self-exaltation, self-effort, the haughtiness of ancient Israel, which is the tendency. So actually the word high is a supplied word. So she's just saying they're separate words. But it's actually implied in the word way. That word way is not just a path, it's something that's a highway. So, but yeah, I think we could apply that there as well, the idea of self-exaltation. So, let's see how long that took me. Well, it took me about an hour, and to go through that part. So we're going to get started on Daniel chapter 10. We'll take a break yet. And, in the notes that you have, if you've printed them out, I have this list and some of it's a little bit sparse. And you might want to write in there and fill it in on your own. But I'm going to erase this. So you can always get a screenshot of it. Any thoughts on this before I erase it? Anything that somebody thinks I should add? Just, and if you have some thoughts on this before I erase it. Anything that jumped out at you? If not, I'll erase it.
One thing that comes to me is that they're all quite warlike too, and they want to expand their territory. You know, they've got this urge always to acquire more possessions, more territory, more of a population.
Who does that? All these.
All of them.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome.
Yeah. Well, and actually, Medo-Persia much more than Babylon. Babylon wasn't that concerned about expanding their empire as Medo-Persia was. So Babylon, they had Babylon, right? And all they were really concerned about is the protection racket to get money to bring into Babylon. They didn't take over territories and make it part of Babylon. Medo-Persia is the power that did that. And then Greece also did that under Alexander the Great. And then, of course, Rome really did that. Much bigger empire at its height than these other ones. But Persia was pretty big too. So, okay, well, thanks for that. Now, let's look at Daniel chapter 10. Blow this up a little bit so people can see it. Now, so we're going to deal, of course, with the chronology of this. And this is one of the problems that we have. So we know that when we looked at Daniel chapter 8, and I'll just flip back there quickly. So we had these visions of Daniel. In Daniel 8, it's the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. In Daniel 9 is the 1st year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus. And then Daniel chapter 10 is the 3rd year of Cyrus. And there's about 19 years between the 3rd year of Belshazzar to the 1st year of Darius, and another couple of years from the 1st year of Darius to the 3rd year of Cyrus. So to try to make this clear to people, I'm going to have to, again, go back to the whiteboard. So this is a controversial point, not so much in this movement. That's not working. So I'm going to leave out the Daniel 8. I'll just go to Daniel 9. So here we got the 1st year of Cyrus. Maybe I'll do this, or Darius. So we'll do Darius here. So this is Darius the Mede, not Darius the Persian. And maybe I'll lay it out like this. So you're going to have over here, he's going to take over Babylon with Cyrus as, I'll put Cyrus here. So he's going to take over Babylon in the fall. So maybe I'll lay it out this way. So you got Darius and you got Cyrus. Cyrus is a general. And so here in the fall of 539, Babylon is going to fall. And so these years that I'm putting here, I should do this differently. Okay, so these are going to be fall to fall. That's what I wanted to do. I'll leave that. Yeah, I'm going to do this differently. Sorry about that. I'm going to put our years in between here. This will be easier. And I did this wrong as well. Yeah, spring to spring. There we go. So we're going to put this as 539 BC, 538, 537, 536. And so this is 539, and it's in the fall of 539, Babylon falls. Specifically, October 13th at midnight, Babylon falls. And that's Cyrus who comes in here. Now, Darius has been king for a long time. He's basically 70 years old. He's an old man. Cyrus is his nephew. And Cyrus has been king for a long time too. I think since about he's been king for a long time, since the 550s BC. But he's the king of Persia. Darius, of course, is the king of the Medes. So this is the kingdom of Babylon. So you got Babylon here, and it's going to end. And this line here is January 1st, 538. But you can see it's going to fall in 539. Now, in this way that we count these years, this is, of course, according to a Julian calendar. But the year, the civil year, so I'm going to put it here, the civil year is going to begin slightly before here. So this is what we would call 538. And this is the civil year, it's fall to fall. Now, Babylon counts their reign spring to spring. But also there's some loose language that occurs when you're talking about the reign of a king. Just it's more a colloquialism. So when Cyrus conquers Babylon here, he's not the king of Babylon. He becomes the king of lands. Darius technically becomes the king of Babylon. And it's not until here somewhere where Darius dies and Cyrus reigns. And when he reigns, he succeeds to the throne, but it's not until, I put this in the wrong spot, it's right here, somewhere here in the fall of 537, Darius dies, Cyrus reigns. We don't know exactly when that is, but Ellen White says within about 2 years from the fall of Babylon, Cyrus succeeds to the throne at the death of Darius. And that's in Prophets and Kings that she says this. And if we look here, how we're counting years, can really affect how we look at something, because we have different ways we can count years here. We can count years on our calendar, right? We can count these years. We could count these years. So we could count the years fall to fall. We could count the years spring to spring. Or we could count the years January 1st to January 1st. And depending on how we're counting, we could come up with a different number. But in Daniel chapter 9, it says it's in the first year of Darius. Now, that can either mean technically it would be from the spring to spring, 538 to 537. That occurs. But the first year of Darius can also refer to his accession year. So the year that he begins to reign can also be included in his first year. So there isn't really a word for a succession year in the Bible. They'll sometimes say that that's the first year. They'll say when he began to reign, they'll refer to that. But they don't really make a distinction. They don't call this the succession year. Even though we do now, they don't have a word for that in the Bible. And I'm not really sure that they even have a word for it in ancient languages. Somebody begins to reign. That's what they would say. He begins to reign. And the year he begins to reign would refer to this whole year, but sometimes, it can just refer to this part of the succession year. So we have no way of knowing, is what I'm trying to say, from the biblical language. Now, we now have this third year of Cyrus that's talked about. Well, we know when we were studying in Ezra that this here is the first year of Cyrus, right? Darius dies, Cyrus comes to the throne, he succeeds to the throne, and technically we call this here 536. We called it the first year of Cyrus. So we can, we would say that this is the first year of Darius, and this is the second year of Darius, and then this would be the first year of Cyrus. So these dates would belong to him, to Cyrus, Darius. So these dates here would belong to him. Those would be his years of reign. And the first year would include this one, which is obviously the last year of Belshazzar. Since he's not in the same kingdom, you would definitely include this as his first year. Anywhere in here would be the first year of Darius, because they're not even acknowledging Belshazzar's year. And now, some people would even argue that they might make this the first year, this the second year, and this the third year. There are times that some kingdoms do that. Northern Israel does that, where they'll call this the first year when you're ending another dynasty, and you're going to start this new dynasty because you've just killed all the previous family. You're going to start a new dynasty. You're going to just call this your first year, and this would be your second year. Right? So there are differences that happen, and that's called a non-accession year dating. But here we would assume that this is the first year, this is the second year. Doesn't really matter, because we're only ever mentioned this first year of the reign of Darius. But we know when Cyrus comes to the throne, this is within about 2 years of the fall of Babylon. So within about means it's within. So it means it's before, obviously, it's not more than 2 years, but it's about. That means it's not, anywhere within. It's close to 2 years. That's the way I take that phrase. But then we're going to see that Cyrus is going to start his first year technically here in the spring of 536. Now, my contention is that in Daniel chapter 10, that this is actually, when they say the third year of Cyrus, they're actually referring to this year. So I'm going to argue that this is the third year, and this is the second year. So I got to put my spring to spring things here. Let's get rid of this civil one. This is the second year, and this here is the first year of Cyrus, and here's where Babylon falls. So I'm counting Cyrus's reign in Daniel chapter 10 as starting with the fall of Babylon. And this is one way that his reign is counted. As king of lands, he's counted this way. Because even though he's the general, when he conquers Babylon, he's not the king of Babylon. Darius is. But he is the king of lands. So, and to try to understand these titles, because Persia was this large empire, and it was Medo-Persia, they were dividing these titles amongst themselves. But he's been the king of Persia for a long time. So it's not just a short period of time. I can't remember how long it is. I should keep these things in my mind, but I don't remember. It's something like 15 years or 19 years or something. He's been king of Persia when Babylon falls. So this expression here, the third year of Cyrus, I place here. Now, if you read in the Spirit of Prophecy, and she addresses Daniel chapter 10, she uses some vague language, is the only way that I can look at it. Is she uses some vague language regarding this. And she doesn't explicitly state that this is what this is about, Daniel chapter 10 is about. We're going to look at Daniel 10 now. So when we go through this and we look at the Spirit of Prophecy, she doesn't tell us in a clear way when this is and what the prayer is about. And some people have interpreted it that this is actually events in 534 or 535. Some people have different ways of looking at it. So they're events over here a couple of years later, after the Jews had already returned to Jerusalem. So let's take a look at these passages now. So in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. And the thing was true, but the time appointed was long. And he understood the thing and had understanding of the vision. In those days, I, Daniel, was mourning 3 full weeks. I ate no pleasant bread, neither came flesh nor wine in my mouth, neither did I anoint myself at all till 3 whole weeks were fulfilled. And in the 24th day of the 1st month, as I was by the side of the great river which is Hiddekel, then I lifted up mine eyes and looked, and behold, a certain man clothed in linen, whose loins were girded with fine gold of Uphaz. And his body also was like unto the beryl, and his face as the appearance of lightning, and his eyes as lamps of fire, and his arms and his feet like in color to polished brass, and the voice of his words like the voice of a multitude. So here we have, the setting is, the time-wise, it's the 3rd year of Cyrus, whatever that means. And Daniel is mourning 3 full weeks. And we know that he's mourning over the time that you would normally have the Passover, because it's in the 24th day of the 1st month that he's in his 21st day of fasting. So he's been fasting for 3 weeks. And so that means he would have started on like either the 3rd or 4th, depending how you count it, of the 1st day of the 1st month. And now he's by the great river, which is Hiddekel. Now, there's, in studying these rivers, Hiddekel, Tigris, Euphrates, nomenclature in the Bible is a tricky thing. That is, the naming of things is not always as clear-cut as you would think. So when we looked at chapter 8, go over here to chapter 8, we see that this is by the bank of the river which of Ulai, and Daniel chapter 10 is by the river Hiddekel, and we would say that this is the Tigris. So in that's normally what we would say, and I would say, I'm not gonna totally say which it is, but I believe it's the Tigris. But I think we can prove that from Spirit of Prophecy, if I remember correctly. But I haven't looked at it for a long time. But the river Ulai, some people have tried to argue that it's the Euphrates, where it's actually a river in Persia. So all I'm saying is that when you're looking at the naming of things, you have to be careful. Just because you have a name for something, that name can be attached to different things, the same name. So different people can use a name of something else. Like if I said that you were in York, now if you're in England, you would think it's a city in England, but it used to be a place in Canada called York. And of course, New York was named after York. And of course, Warburg, where I'm from in Alberta, there's a Warburg in Germany, which Warburg was named after. So people will often name things after other places. But we would think that this is the Tigris, the Hiddekel here. Unless, if somebody can correct me or give me confirmation on that, that would be nice. So anyway, he's in the 1st month, and he's in the 24th day of the 1st month. And then he has this vision, which is a vision of Christ. And then in verse 7, it says, I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, for the men that were with me saw not the vision, but a great quaking fell upon them, so that they fled to hide themselves. Now, we've placed an emphasis in studying these things on some of the symbolism, the language of quaking, to try to place these on a line, and I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to look at it in a more straightforward way to try to understand what's happening when Daniel is having this vision, to try to place it and see if we can make sense out of it. So he says, therefore I was left alone and saw this great vision, and there remained no strength in me, for my comeliness was turned in me into corruption, and I retained no strength. Yet heard I the voice of his words. And when I heard the voice of his words, then I was in a deep sleep on my face, and my face toward the ground. And behold, an hand touched me which set me upon my knees and upon the palms of my hands. And he said unto me, O Daniel, man greatly beloved, understand the words that I speak unto thee, and stand upright, for unto thee am I now sent. And when he had spoken this word unto me, I stood trembling. So we saw, this quaking and this trembling, which people place in a specific time. And these touches that happen, we have a way that we place these. I'm not going to address those, just you can do studies on those. And then he said unto me, Daniel, fear not. Or he said unto me, fear not, Daniel, for from the first day that thou didst set thine heart to understand and to chasten thyself before thy God, thy words were heard, and I am come for thy words. So his words were heard 21 days previous to this. And the angel is coming here because of his words, right? So there's actually two characters here. There's Gabriel and there's Christ. So what he sees and who he hears talking are two different things. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. So I heard your words, but the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me 21 days. But lo, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. So we have some characters introduced here that it's not really clear who he's talking about. The prince of the kingdom of Persia, who would that be? That's one of the questions we would ask. Now, this word prince in Hebrew is sar. It's not the same as king, which is melech. And it says, I remained there with the kings of Persia, or melechim. So that's the word for kings. So it's not even sure why there's a plural, because we would think that at this time, you would think there's only a king. But actually, if we look at it, one of the things that can help us know the time of this is that Cambyses co-reigned with his father for a short while. And I'll probably go into that because I know I have the resources somewhere where I can show what happened. But Cambyses, at the beginning of Cyrus's reign, reigned with him for a short while. But something happened that caused him to fall out of favor for a short while. He did something, and I'm not sure what it is. There's speculation about what he had done. But he wasn't co-reigning for a while. But then after Cyrus died, he began to reign again. So one of the things that we could do, we could eliminate, and that's what I have to look at. I have to look at specifically what year Cambyses stopped co-reigning with his father. So that's an interesting point. So when it says the kings of Persia, this would imply that there's two kings, not just one. But we would just normally think there's one king of Persia. And so we have the prince of the kingdom of Persia. Now, if we were to apply this to Cambyses, saying that he's the prince, we don't know how that Cambyses could oppose Gabriel. And then Michael is going to come in, which is Christ. And it says one of the chief princes. The Hebrew just says something different. And the implication is the chief prince, or the one chief prince. And here, this is reference to Michael, who is the archangel. There's only one archangel. Arch is Latin. The word here in Hebrew for chief is Rosh, which means head. And so there isn't a bunch of archangels. There's one archangel, one who is the chief or the head of all the angels, which is Christ. And his name Michael is used when he's in conflict with Satan. So the suggestion here is that the prince of the kingdom of Persia is actually Satan himself, because he's the one who is withstanding Michael, not Cambyses. So that's maybe, a lot of people don't really know what I'm talking about, possibly, who are watching this or participating here. But this is the way that it's understood by many people of what's happening. So the prince of the kingdom of Persia is an expression in this context which refers to Satan. And Michael is Christ. He's not a created being. It's just a name or a title that's used. It's a challenge, which means who is like God. And it's a challenge against Satan, who seeks to be in the place of Christ. So he's the chief prince, or the first chief prince. He's the one over all princes, over all kingdoms. He's King of kings and Lord of lords. But he's also this Michael, this archangel over all the angels. So Christ is going to come and help him. So now how this is happening, how these types of battles occur, I'm not really sure. We would probably imagine that there's swords involved and all kinds of things, human imaginations of how things happen. But I would look at that this is a battle over the mind of Cyrus. And Satan's agents, the people that he has control over, would be putting suggestions into Cyrus's mind that he shouldn't do whatever it is that he's struggling over. Now, if we were going to place this, and for those of you who studied through the book of Ezra with me, we know that there was this opposition that happened, and we can look at that right now. So let's go over there back to Ezra, and this would be in chapter 4, I believe. So the adversaries who opposed the building of the temple, and it says in verse 4 and 5, or chapter 4, verse 5 and 6 of Ezra 4, verse 5 and 6. I can start at verse 4 too. Then the people of the land weakened the hands of the people of Judah and troubled them in building, and hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus king of Persia, even unto the reign of Darius king of Persia. And in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, and we saw that this Ahasuerus here is Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, wrote they unto him an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the days of Artaxerxes, in verse 7, and this Artaxerxes we would look at as false Smyrtus. So these names are going to be important when we look at it. So I'm going to write this on the board. We'll get rid of this. So what we have is Darius, and he's reigning at the same time as Cyrus, so we'll put them together. And then Darius is going to die. Cyrus continues, and he's going to reign with Cambyses, or Cambyses, however you want to say his name. And then after this, we're going to actually have Cyrus reigning by himself for a while. And then we're going to have Cambyses. And then we're going to have false Smyrtus. And then it's going to be Darius, the Persian. Right. So these are these kings in the order that they occur. And so we see some co-reigning, Media and Persia. Cyrus and Cambyses are both reigning, but now it's just Persia. The Median kingdom has ended in a sense, though there's still their territory. And it could be that Cambyses takes over some of the Median territory as a co-regent. Then Cyrus is reigning by himself. He dies. Cambyses reigns. Then falls Smyrtus. And I'm actually trying to jam this in a little tighter. So Cambyses, false Smyrtus. And then we got Darius. We call him, Darius the Persian. Okay. And then we're going to have, after him, we're going to have another king, but we'll deal with that then. So you got these, and we'll deal with that. So anyway, you have false Smyrtus, Darius the Persian, and it says that the enemies are going to be frustrating them all through this reign, all through these periods of reign, up until the time of Darius the Persian. So the enemies are opposing them. Now, the argument that would be made is that the Israelites, or the Jews, went back to Jerusalem, and after they are back there and started building the temple, this is where Daniel chapter 10 comes in the third year of Cyrus. So this is kind of the argument that people have, where they place Cyrus. And I would sort of argue that if there's going to be an issue that's going to be that this decision that has to be made, and Ellen White just refers to this decision that has to be made by Cyrus. So, and we might look at that if I can bring, because I don't have all the statements here right now. Probably should have had those. But Ellen White makes these statements where if you read it and you're not really looking at the whole context, you might get the impression that this is just something that happens after they came back to the land. And part of it is in Prophets and Kings, when you read about it, she's just kind of grouping this all together, and she's going back. Now, somebody asked the question, why is he called false Smyrtus? Well, that's because he's not Smyrtus. He's an imposter. And so there's a lot of different, I'm not going to go into the details of this, but there's Bardia, who, and I can't even remember all the details offhand, but somebody was killed. I think it was Smyrtus, and this guy claims to be Smyrtus, but he's Bardia, if I remember that correctly. But I always get names mixed up. So that's why he's called false Smyrtus. And that's what Sister White calls him. So she accepts that argument. Some people say that he wasn't actually false Smyrtus, that was a story made up later by Darius. And this history is very sketchy. Different historians describe it differently. But I'm using what Ellen White says, and it seems to me the most logical way to look at it of what occurred. So thanks for the question. So we have all these different kings, and we have this issue that's being addressed, that Michael and Satan are dealing with in relationship to Cyrus. And we go now in, so the prince of the kingdom of Persia, we read that. And so in verse 14, now I am come to make thee to understand. Just got to get this back up here. Now I am come to make thee understand. Oh, that's not working. Sometimes it does that. Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days, for yet the vision is for many days. And when he had spoken such words unto me, I set my face toward the ground and became dumb. And behold, one like the similitude of the sons of men touched my lips. Then I opened my mouth and spake, and said unto him that stood before me, O my Lord, by the vision my sorrows are turned upon me, and I have retained no strength. For how can the servant of this my Lord talk with this my Lord? For as for me, straightway there remained no strength in me, neither is there breath left in me. And then there came again and touched me, one like the appearance of a man, and he strengthened me. And I said, O man greatly beloved, and said, O man greatly beloved, fear not, peace be unto thee, be strong, yea, be strong. And when he had spoken unto me, I was strengthened, and said, Let my Lord speak, for thou hast strengthened me. And then he said, Knowest thou wherefore I am come unto thee? And now will I return to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I am gone forth, lo, the prince of Grecia shall come. I will show thee that which is noted in the scripture of truth, that there is none that holdeth with me in these things, but Michael, your prince. So So we have this account of this battle that's going on between Christ and Satan, and there is this issue that we're not really told what it is, of what this battle is about. And we see that he's going to return and to fight with the prince of Persia. And when I am gone forth, lo, the prince of Grecia shall come. So to talk about the prince of Persia here as a spiritual power, as we're talking about Satan. And then we talk about the prince of Grecia. I don't necessarily have a good answer to that. I can't explain it. What's the difference between the prince of Persia and the prince of Grecia? In this context, the way that I've looked at it is that Satan is working under the kingdom of Persia, but he's eventually going to work under the kingdom of Greece. So this is Satan utilizing these powers to persecute God's people. And that this battle that has been won by Christ is still going to go on. That means the prince of Persia is still going to bring opposition to the Jews from time to time because of the enemies, the work of the enemies. Now, of course, the work of the enemies ultimately is Satan, who is the one behind these things. But these are people who are actually bothering the king of Persia, the kings of Persia, and eventually the kings of Greece that are behind them, putting forth Satan's agenda. That's the way that I would look at it. So I wouldn't take the prince of the kingdom of Persia and the prince of Persia as referring to people, or the prince of Grecia as referring to people. They would refer to the power behind them, which is Satan. And that's the way I've taken it. Now, I could do a whole study on this, and this is a study I did years and years ago, dealing with Gog and Magog and the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal in the book of Ezekiel. So this is where I came to understand what this prince referred to. It doesn't refer to it can refer to a king or a prince, but in this context, it's referring to a spiritual power. Maybe we should look at this. See if I can remember how to spell Meshach. Yeah, so this would be Ezekiel 38. So this is kind of a little bit of sidetrack in the study. Now, this passage here, Ezekiel 38, you probably don't know this religious group, but there's a group called the Christadelphians. And I actually went to one of their meetings back in about 86, it would have been 1985 or 84. And they had this meeting, which was advertised. I think I found the flyer at a mall or something like that. So I went to this religious meeting to see what it was about. And it was about Ezekiel 38. So they have this belief that when it talks about some of these kingdoms, they interpreted them as armies dealing with Russia and so forth. So I'll just read a bit of it. It says, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. So they took this Tubal and Meshach to refer to Russia. Meshach they took as Moscow, and Tubal as Tubalski, and the Tubal River. These places in Russia, what we would now call Russia. And so they had all these prophecies dealing with Russia. And they would translate this, the chief prince, as Rosh, the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal, because the word Rosh means head. So that word translated chief is the word Rosh, just like the book of Genesis in Hebrew is called Bereshit. It just means in the beginning, Rosh, Berosh, in the beginning. So that word Rosh, or Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. So they would say that this is the prince of Russia, Moscow, and Tobolsky. And that's the way that they tried to understand that. Now, when I ended up studying this through, in contradiction to their views, I came to understand that this word prince here, which is Tsar, I came to understand that that was referring to the satanic power. So you have the head. Gog is this satanic power, which we see in the book of Revelation. We see Gog and Magog, right? So anyway, I'm not going to go into a thorough study of this, but that's where I first came across this idea, was studying this, and I came to realize their view was kind of nonsense as I went through and looked at the Hebrew and read a number of different books about this history and who these people are according to the Bible in other places. So they seem to ignore a lot of scriptures. They just kind of interpreted similarities of words, what we'd call a false etymology. They just said, oh, these words must be referring to this. Now, so let's go back to Daniel 10. So when we get to there, at the end, I will show thee that which is noted in the scripture of truth, and there is none that holdeth with me in these things but Michael your prince. Now, chapter 11 confuses a lot of people because it says, also I in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and strengthen him. And I've even seen commentators think that Daniel chapter 11 is given in the first year of Darius the Mede, because it seems just in a surface reading that this is talking about the first year of Darius the Mede. But this is an important point. When we look at this, so we'll go back here. Here we are in the third year of Cyrus, and it says, and I even in the third year of Darius the Mede came to confirm and strengthen him. So he's saying, just like I'm doing with Cyrus right now, I did in the first year of Darius the Mede. And what would be the issue in the first year of Darius the Mede? Well, we would have to argue that this is about that the Jews were going to be the issue. Well, we know that Darius came and conquered Babylon, so that's in God's direction. And we also know that Daniel was connected with Darius, and the issues dealing with Daniel in the story of Daniel chapter 6, that's going to address Darius. But there's also this favor that's put to the Jews at that time. It begins under Darius the Mede. So God was also strengthening Darius in overcoming Babylon, even though it's Cyrus who's the general. God says, I was there to strengthen and confirm Darius the Mede. So that's pretty interesting. Now, it also could be read another way. When you look at Daniel chapter 10 at the very end of it, because in Hebrew, it's not quite like English. I mean, we know that when we refer to he, we're usually referring to the previous proper name that's used. So when I say he in a sentence, it's usually pretty clear based on word order who I'm talking about. So if I stood to confirm and strengthen him, the question is who? Who's the him? Well, we would just say, well, it's Darius the Mede. But it is very possible, based on how Hebrew is written, that it's actually referring to a previous person that's mentioned, and that would be Cyrus. And Cyrus would have been confirmed and strengthened to overthrow Babylon. and I think that's actually the most likely thing that we would take from this passage is it's not referring to Darius at all. It's in the first year of Darius the Mede that Cyrus was confirmed and strengthened. But I'm not saying it's not referring to Darius in any way, because Darius obviously was confirmed and strengthened in relationship to Daniel. So in Daniel chapter 6. So also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and strengthen him. And there. Okay. And now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, and so we're going to stop here. I think we need to take a break, just a short break, before we get into Daniel chapter 11. So let's pause, and just going to Dear Father in heaven, we again thank you for the time we have to study. May you help us to complete the study here today as we go through the first part of Daniel chapter 11. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So let's go back to Daniel 11. So Daniel chapter 11. It says, also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and strengthen him. So we know that him could be referring to Cyrus or Darius or both in an indirect way. But, it's in the singular. I would say, if I was going to place it, I would say it's referring to Cyrus, because he's the one who took the army of Persia and Media into Babylon to overthrow Belshazzar. And then it says, now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. So I probably should just put that without all the Strong's numbers there. So we've already come to understand this, but so many of you are familiar with this, but some of you aren't. And so we know that there's going to be, in the time of Cyrus, this is where we are, we're in the time of Cyrus, that, so we're not in the time of Darius, right? So he's referring back to the time of Darius, but he says there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. So those 3 kings would be Cambyses, False Smyrtus, and Darius. That's who we would mark. Now, Ellen White, when she's writing about Ezra chapter 4, and we have these names. So we have Cambyses is called Ahasuerus, and False Smyrtus is called Artaxerxes, and the Darius is called Darius. So some people have taken these names, and I've discussed it in the study of the book of Ezra. But so the biblical names here are, however you spell it, Ahasuerus. I'll just spell it messily so you can't tell. And this would be Artaxerxes. That's how
Can you switch the screen?
Switch the screen. Thank you. Yeah. So we got Ahasuerus here, Artaxerxes here, but this is not the Ahasuerus of the book of Esther. This is Cambyses, and these are titles. And we know that the king, the 4th that shall come, is going to be Xerxes, and he's also called Ahasuerus. Right? So we have 2 different people who are referred to as Ahasuerus. And we know Artaxerxes is going to come later after Xerxes. And so some people have said, well, this in Ezra chapter 4, that this is referring to Xerxes, Artaxerxes, and then there's another Darius who follows later. And so they try to take this story in Ezra chapter 4, and they try to place it after Artaxerxes. Of course, it doesn't really make sense because in the context, when you read, it's pretty clear that it's talking about this period here before the temple is built. But of course, what they do is they put the building of the temple as way later. Now, I'm just going to show this to you because you might run into this someday. So they're going to put Darius, the Median, and then they're going to put Cyrus, and then they're going to put Cambyses, but they're going to call him Ahasuerus, or no, they're not going to call him Ahasuerus. They're just going to have Cambyses. And then they're going to have Smerdis. We'll just call him Smerdis for short. And then they're going to have Darius. But they ignore all this. The only thing that they think that's happening is you got Cyrus, and they say all the way to this other Darius. So you're going to have Darius, Xerxes, and then you're going to have Artaxerxes, and then there's going to be another Artaxerxes. But then they're going to have this Darius way over here, and this is like in, long after 457. So they're going to ignore all this history, and they're going to say that Cyrus, from all the way to here, there's this opposition, and then they're going to take the two stories from Ezra chapter 4, and they're going to put them after Artaxerxes. So they're going to put them, they're going to have Xerxes, Ahasuerus, and then they're going to have Artaxerxes, and then they're going to have the temple built in this other Darius. It doesn't work. I've tried it out. It just makes sort of the whole thing not make sense. But when they do this, they also shorten. They don't have Babylon fall in 539. They shorten up all this history. They say that all these historians are wrong, that all this archaeology is wrong, and all this kind of stuff. So my point is, Ellen White does it this way, and that should be good enough for us, I guess. But I always tend to look at what other people say, and I try to see what makes sense and what doesn't. Because I'm in a sense, I'm always testing Adventism. Is Adventism true or not? But what I found is that Ellen White, she notices details in history and in archaeology. She doesn't have any understanding of it, but she notices details that in her day nobody knew, but we later found out. So this was one of my evidences that Ellen White is inspired. And one of the reasons why she doesn't sometimes tell us something explicitly, because when the Bible tells us this is the third year of Cyrus, Ellen White could just clear that up for us. But there was nobody else in her time doing that. So she hints at it. Because if you read the old commentators, they put this as afterwards. That third year of Cyrus is after the Jews had already come back and laid the foundation of the temple. But I would argue that when you look at, and so I'm sort of going back a bit, when you look at that, the argument there, the issue that's going to be dealt with is this decree. And we dealt with it in the book of Ezra, so I didn't go into detail on it. But one of the things is we can then mark from the 24th day of the first month, if that's when Cyrus then issued his decree. Daniel's praying for 21 days, and then at the end of 21 days, Christ can come to him and Gabriel and say, now the Jews can go back. That's what's implied. But we also have to recognize that chapter 10, 11, and 12 are all connected. So we have this narrative, or this story, if you want to say it, in chapter 10, where there's this great controversy issue. And now you get to Daniel chapter 11. And we know that we're going to parallel these events to our time. And we never did that for a long time. We've studied Daniel chapter 11, and we accept Uriah Smith's basic structure of it. Ellen White endorses it. It's historically accurate. We can do that. But we can also see that there's a parallel in these kings with our time. So we have these kings. We have Cambyses, and then you're going to have three kings stand up. So the three kings are Cambyses, because you got Cyrus, he's co-reigning, then Cyrus reigns. And so Cambyses, however you want to look at it, he's going to be the first, Ptolemy the second, Darius the Persian is the third, and then you're going to have a fourth, and he shall be far richer than them all, and that's Xerxes. And of course, this starts to make sense when you look at what's going to happen next, that you're going to see they skip all those other kings. They skip Artaxerxes, they skip the other Artaxerxes. There's another Artaxerxes the second. They're going to skip the other Darius the second. They're going to skip all those people, and then they're going to just go to Greece. And the question is, why would they do that? Because the issue has to do with Xerxes, what he does. So Heidi and I watched a documentary dealing with this, with Xerxes' plan. So in the Bible, it talks about this in Esther chapter 1, where Xerxes has this feast. And we're going to look at that a little bit more, but that feast is recorded in history. So Xerxes did all this planning to fight against Greece, and he lost. And so we watched the whole thing dealing with that battle and how all the planning went. So it was very, very interesting. So we have this, and we know, and I'm not going to, go into detail as much as we have in our other studies, but we could see that the end of Daniel chapter 11, verse 40 to 45, is that when we go through the book of chapter 11, this is what we're going to really do next week, is we're going to do a study on Daniel chapter 11, and we'll see how far we get. I sort of feel that we're not going to get very far, because I do want to do this in a little bit more detail. Now, remember, part of my premise in this study, it's the connection between Leviticus 26 and the book of Daniel. And this is the thing that I wouldn't have been able to see back in 2013, because my understanding of Daniel 11 was pretty sketchy back then. I knew Daniel 11 verse 40 to 45 to some degree, but even in 2013, I wasn't, I had not done any thorough studies on Daniel 11 verse 40 to 45. I'd done some. I watched some videos, but I hadn't done any personal study. And also, I had not done any study on Daniel 11 other than I read Uriah Smith's book, Daniel 11, maybe, 30 years before or something like that. I might have read it. So I was familiar with the idea of what Daniel 11 was about. I knew some of the issues dealing with the latter part of Daniel 11. Obviously, I knew a lot about Daniel 12 because there was important things there connected with Revelation chapter 10, I believe. And so, we had all these things that I had studied out. But Daniel 11 has even more connections with Leviticus 26 than I realized, and probably even more that I haven't yet realized. So, we obviously see this history here, where we've taken this and aligned it with our history. So when we deal with Cyrus, Darius, and then Artaxerxes, we know that this is marking a reform line that we would call, it starts with the time of the end, and this is the reform line of the decrees. Now here in this line, we don't have Artaxerxes, but we do have the king of the first decree and the king of the second decree, Darius. And when you go through this, you have Cyrus, Darius, Cambyses, Ptolemy, Darius the Persian, Xerxes, and then Artaxerxes is the seventh, which is extremely important. So in the context of the 2520, it's going to be important understanding this idea of these seven kings. So they're first seven kings of Persia. And We also know that this parallels the 7 trumpets, so we could look at Millerite history. There's so many things that we could do. We could look at the last 7, or the last 7 kings of Judah, and we can see that in there, not all of the kings are marked with a waymark. Obviously we have Manasseh is marked with a waymark because of the 4 7 times, and then we have Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin and Zedekiah all marked with a waymark because each of those experienced one of the 7 times, the 4 7 times. But Josiah is listed as one of the 4 7 times, or Ammon or Jehoahaz. So not all of the kings are marked. And same thing here. If we're going to put the decrees, they're going to be in the first. Well, I guess the second one would be Cyrus, technically, and Darius and Artaxerxes. And so we've done this idea of the kings, of the first 7 kings and the last 7 kings. We've looked at it in different ways, and I'm not going to do a study on that. The only thing I can say is that when I first looked at this study, is I wasn't really happy with it in the sense that it seemed to me that we were using it to mix up the lines, that there's a significance. It's true, we can kind of place them over top of each other, and that's not really a problem. We can put, Manasseh and all the way to Zedekiah. We could place it over top of this, the first kings of Persia, the first kings. But when we start to deal with the last kings, I think we also have a bit of a problem in that the first and the last, even though they speak of each other, I think sometimes we could have done them in reverse order, would have actually made more sense. So I wasn't really happy with the study on it. I didn't think it was complete, and I still haven't completed it myself, that it's made sense. But what we can do is we can deal with the kings that we have in our history. So just a simple way we'll do it, we'll say that this is Reagan. He would parallel Darius, and we would have Bush the first. He would parallel Cyrus. Right. So these 2 kings are at the time of the end. Right. So we can mark this as the time of the end. And then we would say there's still going to 3 that are going to stand up. Right. So we would have Clinton. So we'll put Clinton over here. Lines up with Cambyses. And then we're going to have Bush the second. He would line up with false Smyrdes. And then we'd have Obama. He would line up with Darius. And of course, he's the one who does the taxes. Darius is the taxer. And then you're going to have Trump. Now, the one thing about this when we look at it is, and this is just an aside and this is just a suggestion, but when we look at it, we can see that we're talking about the first 7, well, this is the first 6 kings, but when we get to Artaxerxes, he's going to be the 7th. And we're not usually doing this study in connection with that, but we have 6 kings here, and we're going to have 6 kings here of the United States. But if these are the last 6 kings, why isn't there a 7th? And so my argument that the 7th would still be Trump. There's a change that happens under Trump. So, but that's just a suggestion, and I'm not even going to develop it at all. But the thing is, there should be, in my mind, if we're going to look at the first 7 kings of Persia, which we do, we would have to look at the last 7 kings. And so Trump must, in a way, be both of those. But, I could be wrong about that. So anyway, that's just an aside. So we know we line these things up this way. And, and it's kind of, to me, it's almost like putting the cart before the horse when we start, if somebody's just doing a study on Daniel chapter 11 for the first time, to all of a sudden just throw this at them. Because if you don't understand the rest of Daniel 11, this can just kind of seem like it's arbitrary, that we just sort of pulled this out of nowhere. But there's a reason why we did this and why it came about. Now, we use this to make a prediction that Trump was going to be the one that was going to be the king after Obama, that it wasn't going to be Clinton. And this was based upon a number of lines of argument. One is Xerxes, has to do with his wealth. Though somebody could argue that Clinton was pretty wealthy. But also, they shall stir up all against the prince of Grecia. And when we look at Greece, Greece is a symbol of the world, but it would be the globalists. And I couldn't see Clinton doing that. But I still tried to make the argument that maybe Clinton could fulfill that. One is, I didn't see how Trump was going to win personally. So I tried to say, well, if Clinton did it, how would it be fulfilled? How would I have to interpret that verse? And it would have to be differently. But the initial idea was to stir up all against the realm of Grecia, would be that Trump is the one that's going to oppose the globalists, not Clinton. So some people were very bold about it and said that Trump was going to win the election, even on the eve of the election when it looked like he wasn't going to win. My friend Kelly Ross seemed to put that as a very positive thing, that Trump was going to win. So he kind of, put everything on that prediction. And he happened to be right, where many of us had actually backed off of that prediction. And we're not confident enough to say that Trump was actually going to beat Clinton. And it would have been much more impressive, I guess, if we had made that prediction a little more boldly. But we didn't, and generally within the movement. So we have this Xerxes here that Trump parallels. But the main idea of this, it's where it led to our understanding of Daniel 11. So when I say, I'm kind of putting the cart before the horse, because this is something that came later. We first understood Daniel 11. And so to come back and start here is kind of maybe not the best way to start. But the thing that I'll say about it is, as we go through Daniel chapter 11, what we will see is that this is logical. Because when we first found out, we didn't understand that Daniel 11, everything was repeating Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45. And so when we're going to go through Daniel 11, what we're going to do, and I have a document that I've been working on, and I'm going to try to get it ready before next Thursday. And that document is going to go through Daniel chapter 11. And I want to go through it with you and you guys to help me make corrections where my understanding is weak or incomplete or wrong, so that we can get it right. Because the document that I want to look at is one where we'll take the verses and I'll have in brackets the fulfillment as understood by Uriah Smith, the historical fulfillment of those events. And then we will put in red the present truth understanding of how that's repeated. So that's what I want to do. And that's why I'm saying it's going to take us a little bit longer, because I'm not going to go as like I am doing now. I want to go through it a bit more slowly, and I'm going to need people's help. So if you know anybody who's like a really good expert on our understanding of Daniel 11, make sure that they come and join us next Thursday to help us, or at least have them look over the document that I'm going to send you. So I'm preparing other documents right now. So I might give you actually an incomplete document, just a partial document without all of the present truth applications in there, maybe just the odd one. And then we're going to try to fill that out in more detail. So I hope that you guys can help me with that. It's something I've been wanting to do ever since 2017, when we first started to understand Daniel 11, not Daniel 11:11, and how all of Daniel repeats, but nobody's ever helped me with it, and my understanding is weak on Daniel 11. So, and the other thing though that I talked about is that as I've looked at Daniel 11, especially what Jeff has been presenting, we can see clearly that Daniel 11 cannot really be understood properly without Leviticus 26. And we're not making that connection in an explicit manner. We're not saying this as we're presenting it. But we can see one is that we have this structure of this chronology of Daniel chapter 11 that is tied to the 2520. And as we see these events being fulfilled in our history, we see that there is this structure that comes from the 2520 and from all the studies that we did in connection with Leviticus 26. So this we have this beginning, which some people are familiar with, some aren't. But I really want people who are interested in this to be able to help me as we go through Daniel chapter 11. And so we're going to get through. I'm not sure if we'll get through Daniel chapter 11 next study. I kind of feel it's going to be 2 studies, and then we would deal with Daniel chapter 12. Maybe we can get through most of Daniel 11 next week, and part of it chapter 11 in the week following, and maybe finish off with chapter 12. But also chapter 12, you can't really understand chapter 12 without chapter 11. So a lot of people have, we tend to separate these chapters too much, in my mind. So I hope that's helpful. I hope people understand where we're going, and I hope people can help me out with this, because it would be a real blessing to have, to have this study. Because if you see it, once I send you the notes for the next study on next Thursday, you'll see why why it would be really useful, because it'd be a very handy tool to have the verses with just these basically footnotes or brackets of the interpretation of Daniel 11, and then some charts and diagrams, which I need to still develop to try to show how that relates to Leviticus 26. So is there any thoughts on this? Any ideas about what I'm doing, or any questions on this part of it? Because this we understand, so I'm just saying this is we're going to be doing all through Daniel chapter 11, looking at the present truth application as well as the historical application of Daniel 11. So any thoughts? Anybody who thinks that they could be willing to help out and do a little bit of research on that? Is there anybody here who really understands Daniel 11 well? I know that's kind of a question. Not everybody's going to say, because we don't understand it super duper well, but has a good handle on what our present truth interpretation is, and some of the issues that arose, or some of the differences that arose. Because one of the problems is, and not everybody's going to be aware of it, but we had a group in Africa that was coming up with an interpretation of Daniel 11 that was being opposed by Parminder, sort of clandestinely maybe, or underhandedly. And it's kind of interesting, because when Parminder started going through Daniel chapter 11, there's a lot of stuff that he did early on that actually allowed our understanding of Daniel 11, that we could then repeat all of it. So he did a lot of the groundwork. Other people then took this up and developed it further, but then Parminder seemed to back off on this understanding. So Parminder has changed a lot of his views from what he had initially. And I find that kind of interesting. I don't know how to interpret that, whether that just was a way of him, me trying to understand somebody else's reasoning or what was in their heart. Obviously I can't, but he has said that he wasn't totally honest when it came to his views. So maybe it's just something that he used truth to try to get in good favor. I don't know. But the thing is, there was a whole bunch of issues, and I don't even know if I'm familiar with all the issues. So hopefully there's somebody who's familiar with the issues of Daniel chapter 11. If you know somebody who's really familiar with those, maybe you should, invite him to this study, or as I said, look at the notes. So any comments on this? I don't know if you guys are awake, but
You could invite Jeff.
well, we could invite Jeff to that study. That's possible. I was thinking maybe of asking him, giving him the notes and just saying, it'd be nice if he came to the study. Because there's a lot of issues that I'm not as familiar with. Did you study it all, Stephen? Very much all the different views of what was happening in Daniel 11? Are you familiar with it at least?
Some things, I'm not too sure.
Yeah,
Hi.
you're probably more familiar than I am. Yeah.
I don't know.
Do you know anybody else who might have been caught up in that a little bit? A lot of the people I know that were caught up in it are gone from the movement now. They're part of the new movement.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Maybe Adelio.
Yeah, I was wondering about Adilio, whether he was familiar with that. So maybe talk to him about it. See if he could participate in the next study. But yeah, I'm going to sort of write an email and make an appeal to people, that haven't been coming to the studies, that this is a particular study that I want to do. And I'll make an appeal to Jeff. Maybe he can get a few more people coming to that who might know some things about this. But I really think that it's something that should be done. It would be a helpful tool in studying Daniel 11, but also presenting it to other people. So, okay, so if there isn't any more comments, we can kneel for prayer, and then we can say our goodbyes after that. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you, Lord, for this study, the time that we've had together. And we know, Lord, that there's still so much that we have missed in studying through Daniel chapter 10, and also comparing Leviticus 26 with the book of Daniel. We just pray that you can continue to be with us in our studies as we have a goal that may be very difficult, but we ask that you can lead and guide, if it's your will, that we can understand and prepare a document on Daniel 11 that will be a useful tool to introduce this message and also to study it ourselves. Be with each person. Thank you for all those that have participated so far. May you continue to bless them and help them in their Christian walk. Thank you for hearing our prayer, and we ask and pray these things in Jesus' name.